Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'll welcome you all to our Bible study today. Hope you're doing well. Those of you that are online, we want to welcome you also, and we're glad for those of you that are here in this room. I just got a text from my wife. She just landed here in the U.S., so she's back home from Africa. She's in New Jersey, but that's close enough. So we'll see her here in a little while, hopefully. But it's good to be with y'all today. So let's continue our journey through Exodus. And today we're going to start in Exodus 28. We're going to do Exodus 28 and 29. Let me just remind you, the book of Exodus, the part we're in now is all about worship, covenant worship. And God is giving Moses instructions on Mount Sinai and specific instructions about the tabernacle, the construction of the tabernacle. And as I put here, and I just put this in your notes last week, I just left it in here today. Some commentators, when they get to this point in Exodus, they cover a whole lot of material all at one time. And the reason for that is when you get to chapter 35, where we are right now, we're getting these specific instructions. When you get to chapter 35, then all the stuff's going to be done according to the instructions. And it's just really highly repetitive material. But there's enough nuance in it that we're going to cover them differently. Okay? So let's look at where we are today. The Lord has given Moses instructions about how he's going to be worshiped. Well, one of the things that he is going to demand from Israel is that there be a group of men who serve as priests. And so when we get to chapter 28, here's the description about the priests and the consecration of the priests. So if you look at chapter 28, let's just read the first few verses just to get our conversation started today. So the Lord says, "Have Aaron your brother brought to you from among the Israelites, along with his sons Nadab and Abihu." Now they obviously will end up being evil, but Eleazar, Ithamar, so they may serve me as priests. Make sacred garments for your brother Aaron to give him dignity and honor. Tell all the skilled workers to whom I have given wisdom in such matters that they are to make garments for Aaron for his consecration, so he may serve me as priest. These are the garments they're to make: a breastpiece, an ephod, a robe, a woven tunic, a turban, and a sash. They're to make these sacred garments for your brother Aaron and his sons, so they may serve me as priests. Have them use gold and blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, and fine linen. So if you'll remember back in Exodus 19, when God gives Israel this call, he says to them, "I want you to be, for me, a kingdom of priests." So the way we historically have interpreted that is that God called all of Israel to represent him to the world, to serve in that priestly function. Now, we know the story, so we know that that's going to serve to be a challenge to Israel to live into that. So, but within the body of Israel, he has set aside a group of people that are going to function as priests to the people of God. And they have two main roles. They're going to represent the people to God, and they're going to represent God to the people. And they're going to be from a certain tribe. God has chosen the tribe of Levi to serve as priests. Not necessarily every Levite was a priest, but all the priests were Levites, if that makes sense. And they will be scattered among the people of God when they finally make their way to the promised land. And they're going to have a certain role and certain function. It's going to be outlined right here in this text. Now here's what's interesting. You remember we talked about this a little bit last week. When Israel was enslaved in Egypt, we believe they learned lots of skills. They did a lot of construction. The Egyptians were known for their expertise in fine linen, and so evidently there were craftsmen who learned this trade while they were still in Egypt as slaves. And now God is going to use all of that for his glory now that they have been set free. And so one of the places where that comes to bear has to do with the actual garments that the priests will wear, in particular the high priest. And so you'll notice in verse 2, God says, I want you to make sacred garments. And then he says, use the skilled workers. I've given them wisdom to know how to do this. So I just put in your outline that these priests, they're adorned with holy clothing, sacred clothing, as they serve before the Lord. And God said to Moses, these clothes they wear will give them dignity and honor. Here's what's fascinating about it. When you go back and read the materials that are going to be used for the construction of the tabernacle, and then read the materials that are used for the construction of the robes and the garments the priests wear, they were the same materials. So they parallel each other. And it's almost like the priest was a mini tabernacle, if that makes sense. In other words, he's wearing the very same clothing that's used for the actual building itself, okay, the tent of meeting, if you will. So they have obviously a very important role to play. Their clothing reminds Israel that they're holy, but it also connects to the place where they're going to serve. Now, if you think about it, at this point in history, and for a long time actually, Israel will not have a royal family. There will be no king in Israel. Israel's a theocracy. So the closest thing you come to royalty in the Israel tradition up to this point will be the priests. So they're going to be adorned in some ways in a fashion that reminded ancient people of royalty, wearing some kind of hat, if you want to call it that, some kind of, not really a crown, but some type of decorative hat. Their clothing would look very different from your average run-of-the-mill person who just happened to live in the camp of Israel. So they almost function as royalty as they serve as priests. Now here's what's interesting, today. There's a long history between what we refer to as vestments that the clergy wears that people within the body of the people of God don't wear. Well, where does that come from? Well, it's rooted here. And it's not just the Jews. The ancient peoples in their temples and their places of worship, typically their leaders, their priests, if you will, wore clothing that was different than the average person. And so you see that on a scale today, even in Christianity. Probably the highest place you see it, if you think about it, if you go to the high church end of the Christian spectrum, the oldest church in the world that would do that would be the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church actually predates the Catholic Church. But the priests and the leaders of the Orthodox Church wear all these vestments, and the vestments are filled with symbolism. If you look at the Roman Catholic Church, whenever they have high and holy worship services, the priests, the bishops, the cardinals, they have all kinds of vestments that they wear. All of them are rich in symbolism. The colors of them, the markings on them, how they're made, the embroidery, pretty much everything that you see one of them wearing is being worn purposefully because it plays a certain function or certain role. Now, as you wind your way through the Christian family and get all the way over here to where we are, that pretty much has ended with us. You still have, in some Baptist traditions, if you look at the Free Church movement, you still have ministers in the Free Church movement that wear vestments. A lot of denominations, the ministers will still wear vestments, particularly if they're overseeing something like communion, if you will. We, in the Baptist family, you don't see it as much, but there are still some in the Baptist tradition where the pastors and the clergy will wear robes. Usually, it's primarily more east of the Mississippi River than west of the Mississippi River. And so, in fact, the church I pastored before I came here, it was very common for ministers who were doing sacerdotal functions, like doing a wedding or overseeing the Lord's Supper. It was not uncommon at all for people at First Baptist Huntsville that I pastored to wear robes when they led in those services. In fact, most of the weddings that I did at First Baptist Huntsville, I was requested to wear a robe. I don't know what happened to y'all when you crossed the Mississippi River. Something happened to you for whatever reason. It's just not as common on this side of the Mississippi River among the Baptist family. It's still common in multiple other denominations, but all of it's connected to this what do you want to call it? This set-apartedness, if you will. This role that you believe that these folks are supposed to play in the life of the people of God. So in this story, the garments are, it's interesting when you read through this text. You have incredible detail on some things, and then you have some things that are just left to your imagination. We have no idea what they were. But they all have some type of, evidently, symbolism and role that the Lord thought was important. And so it's really laid out for us in Exodus 28. So that's what Exodus 28 is all about. It's about the vestments. Now what's going to be fascinating is when the Romans take over the world, y'all may remember this, the palace that Herod builds, the fortress that Herod builds really next to the temple. When the Romans take over the world, the Romans realize how important Israel's religion is. And so it was common among the Romans to allow conquered people to still have their own worship services and their own gods. So the Romans allowed the Judeans to worship. But y'all may remember this, but the Roman procurator kept the high priest's vestments in the fortress Antonia rather than allowing the high priest to have them himself. So when it came time for the high holy functions of the year in the Jewish calendar, the high priest had to go solicit the Romans' permission to get his vestments to go and do the ministry. So that shows you how that kind of chafed the neck a little bit of the Jews, the fact that these holy garments that are prescribed in the book of the law are in the hands of pagans. But that was one of the ways the Romans kept their thumb on the Jews, because in other words, if the Romans were to decide, we're not going to let you do this, one of the ways they could do that is not allow the priest to have the vestments. Does that make sense? So it's kind of a long history with these vestments. And every year when we go to Rome, there's a certain there's a little a district, a segment of Rome where you have these clothiers who make the clothes for the cardinals and the bishops and folks who serve at the Vatican. And typically, some of you have been with us to Rome, typically our folks usually stand me up next to one of those windows as if I'm window shopping, for one of those vestments. But you can imagine, if you're a Roman Catholic bishop and you live in Argentina and you've made your only trip you'll ever make to Rome, maybe, it'd be very important for you to actually purchase your vestments in the seat of Christendom. So they really serve folks that live all over the world, if that makes sense. So it has an ancient history, and it's connected to this very story. So what were the garments? Okay, well, they're varied. It's interesting. Let me just lay them out here for you. First are the undergarments. In other words, there's no detail left out. Okay, you get to the end of chapter 28, verse 42. Make linen undergarments as a covering for the body. He says, reaching from the waist to the thigh. Aaron and his sons must wear these or when they approach the altar to minister the holy place, so they will not incur guilt and die. So in other words, what God is telling Moses, every bit of this is important to me, and if you don't think it is, if you don't do it the way I tell you to do it, you may lose your life. That's how important this is. May sound a little odd to us, but the point is God is sending a message that the things that are going to be connected to the tabernacle are holy, and the people that are going to engage in them are going to be holy people. So it's going to distinguish them. So then you had this tunic. It was verse 39. It's made of some kind of fine linen. Then you have this very interesting robe. This caused scholars all kinds of consternation. This blue robe, verse 31. He says, make this robe of the ephod entirely of blue cloth with an opening for the head at its center. There's to be a woven edge like a collar around this opening so it won't tear. I mean, the detail's incredible, isn't it? Make pomegranates of blue, purple, and scarlet yarn around the hem of the robe. In other words, it's got to be decorative. And then put gold bells on it. So the high priest had bells on this blue robe. And you can only imagine why. Everybody's asked. If you look at verse 35, Aaron has to wear this when he ministers, and the sound of the bells will be heard when he enters the holy place before the Lord and when he comes out, so that he will not die. So there's a lot of symbolism. What in the world is one commentator I read said, so did the high priest wear bells so the Lord would know he was coming. Well, I don't think that would have been the reason. I feel like the Lord would have known he was coming whether he had bells or not. But I think the imagery, though, is just that there's some kind of acknowledgement that this priest is entering into the holy place. Okay? And so, like I said, nothing is left to their own discretion. The article of clothing, there are two articles of clothing that have garnered the most theological attention. The first one's the ephod. Ephod is a Hebrew word. It's just transliterated into English. And it's some kind of a sleeveless apron. It was made of gold, and it had also blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, finely twisted linen. It draped over the shoulders of the priest. It was held together by these two clasps and on the shoulders of the priest. What was fascinating about it was decorated with these two onyx stones with the names of the 12 tribes of Israel engraved. So you have 6 tribes on each shoulder. And there are these gold settings and gold chains that attached it to these shoulder clasps. And the ephod will be very interesting in the history of Israel. It's actually just a simple garment. All it really means is apron. But when it's used in all things holy, it takes on a little different connotation. And so in this particular one, if you look back at verse 6 through verse 14, that's the description of the ephod for the high priest. And it is a very special piece of clothing. You have a little interesting phrase in verse 10. They are to be placed in the order of their birth. And one of the challenges you have there is that some of that's a little bit challenging to figure out and exactly how they chose to put these names on there. But the ephod, though, will become incredibly symbolic for the Jews. They will view it, some of them will, almost like a good luck charm. And that's where it gets dicey. So y'all may remember the story. Y'all remember when Gideon was a judge. If you were to read the story of Gideon, let me just tell you what happened. I'm sure you remember this, but in Judges 8, the Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you, your son, and grandson, because you saved us from the hand of Midian." But Gideon told them, "I'm not going to rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." He said, "I do have one request, that you give me an earring from your share of the plunder." It was the custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. They answered, "We'll be glad to give them." So they spread out a garment. Each one of them threw a ring from his plunder into it. And the weight of the gold rings that he asked for came to 1,700 shekels, not counting the ornaments, the pendants and purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains on the camels' necks. Gideon then made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah in his town. So he made an apron out of gold and set it up on a pole in his town, and the Jews came and worshiped it. Isn't that fascinating? In other words, it so reminded them of the high priest, kind of in their mind, we're bringing the very presence of God into this town. Does that make sense? That's what Gideon was saying. And the text says this: all Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping him there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. Later in Judges 17 and 18, there's a guy named Micah who will do a very similar thing. He will have an ephod made, decorative, and set it up, and people will start worshiping it. And I think the connection there is, y'all, that the ephod was just associated with the presence of God. At least the decorative ephods were. Now, many of the Jewish men wore ephods. That, like I said, they were like an apron. It was a common person's garment. Not the priest's, because the priest was decorative. But y'all remember the time when David was celebrating and his wife Michal saw him, and he went outside among the people, and instead of dressing like the king, all he had on was the ephod. Y'all remember that story? In other words, he was dressed like a commoner. And that was what she was so upset about. Her point to him was, if you go out among the people, you ought to look like the king. And they had a very interesting relationship, actually, David and Michael, but that's a whole other sermon. Because after she got on to him, he said, may you never have any children, which she never did, and they ended up parting ways, so it's kind of a long story. But anyway, the moral of that story is husbands, listen to your wives when they tell you what to wear. I think that's the moral of that story. I'm not really sure. But anyway, then there's the breast piece, okay? This is the second piece of clothing that has garnered a whole lot of theological attention because of what the text says about the breast piece, that it's very detailed as to how it's supposed to be put together, but it's also going to be connected to decision making, which is very fascinating. And so the high priest is supposed to wear this very decorative piece it's not the ephod. Evidently, it's worn over the ephod, but it is a memorial to the Lord. And it has precious jewels, 12 of them, each one of them representing the tribes of Israel, with the names engraved on them. But then it has the Urim and the Thummim actually placed in the breastpiece. There's some kind of little pocket where they go, okay? We'll talk about them in just a second. Then you have a waistband. The ephod and the breastpiece are attached to the waistband so that they don't just flap back and forth. And then the turban and the sash is connected to the turban. Here's what's interesting about the turban. If you'll look at verse 36, the text says, make a plate of pure gold and engrave on it as a seal holy to the Lord and fasten that to the turban. So Aaron was going to go in to lead worship, and he would have a plate on the turban that he was wearing that says holy to the Lord. And what I would say about that, y'all, is what the message there is, it's what some scholars call conscious faith. And what they mean by that is these are not just rituals. You're in the presence of the Lord when you do these things. And that's supposed to be the reminder that because the power is not in the ritual, the power is in the Lord. Okay? The ritual is obedience, and it positions you to be in the presence of the Lord, but the power is not in the ritual. And sometimes people will get that confused and think they can just do the ritual and somehow conjure up God's will and God's plan and God's presence, and that's not how it works. You relate to God in a relationship, and you engage in these rituals as a celebration of that relationship. That's still true for us today, if you think about it. There's nothing, as far as we're concerned, necessarily that's contained just in the ritual of things like the Lord's Supper or baptism. It's in the consciousness of the faith that's connected to it that makes it so meaningful, okay? Then you have these two interesting stones. We've talked about these before. I talked about them on a Sunday morning a while back. But just to remind you, the Urim and the Thummim, this is a really interesting thing that we just don't know a whole lot about. So if you look at verse 30, it says, put the Urim and the Thummim in the breastpiece so they'll be over Aaron's heart whenever he enters the presence of the Lord. And Aaron will bear the means of making decisions for the Israelites over his heart before the Lord. So what would the Urim and the Thummim be? Well, translating them into English is difficult. The best most scholars have come up with is light and dark. So there's the theory that one of the stones was a lighter color, one of the other stone was a darker color. We're not really sure about that, but that's the inference. Here's what we do know. We don't know how it was done, but we do know the high priest could use them as kind of a last resort in determining God's guidance for Israel. In other words, this is not something you went to first, but it was there if needed. And the use was limited, but Israel evidently knew exactly how to use the Urim and the Thummim. In fact, what's interesting is here in Exodus, it's almost as if they already existed before this story, because he doesn't stop and explain what they are. So they evidently already were familiar with them, even when you get to this early in the story, if that makes sense. Now, they appear in several passages in the Old Testament. I just listed some there for you. The place that I think is the most interesting, and I pointed this out in a sermon a couple months ago to y'all, the most interesting place that the Urim and the Thummim show up is on the official crest of Yale University, which I think is quite fascinating. So, and it's in Hebrew, And so I can promise you probably 90% of Yale graduates graduate with a degree from Yale with the seal of Yale on their diploma, and they have no idea that it says Urim and Thummim, and probably would have no idea what that even is. But it typically is referred to as light and truth. That's what Yale says about it. Lex and veritas in Latin. But it's quite fascinating. So how did the priest use the Urim and the Thummim? Well, we don't know. Some scholars say that whenever they got to the point where they needed God's guidance and the high priest was called upon, like I said, typically as a last resort, they would consult God with questions that were just with one-word answers. In other words, this was a very simple question asked of the Lord, and the priest would reach inside the pocket and pull out one of the stones, and whichever one they pulled out, that was the answer. That's what some scholars say. Other scholars say there were probably more than just 2 stones. There were probably a number of stones that were placed in there, and somehow the very same thing was done. Other scholars say they cast the stones. The priest didn't just pull them out. He would cast them, and the way they ended up rolling out, depending upon the relationship of the stones to the priest who cast them, that's how you would find your decision. Now, there's a lot of folks who lean that way because the casting of stones was very common in the ancient world, and it was common among the Jews. You would cast these lots, if you will. Y'all remember in the book of Acts they did that when after Judas had betrayed Jesus and they had to find another disciple. Remember, they cast stones, they cast lots, if you will. Maybe you might even call it drawing straws or whatever imagery you might want to use. It's that same kind of principle. But there's a number of scholars right now who've adopted a completely different approach to that. And I've read several commentators who are saying now they actually believed that when the priest was seeking the will of God, he would bring these stones out and lay them before the Lord, and one of them would start glowing. And that's how they discovered the answer for what God had for them. I think at the heart of it is probably what I would say is this. God's desire was to lead his people. So he showed various ways for Israel to find their way. This is just one of them. That's really the heart of what's being taught here. Some people get really infatuated with all this, and we have some missionary friends that we worked with in Central America, and we were doing a medical clinic there, and Cindy and I were there with several of our church members, and the local shaman showed up, and he's a witch doctor, if you will, because he was sick, and his wife was really sick, and he wanted to be treated, and so it caused quite a stir in the compound, because everybody knew who he was, and so we called our pastor, who's our leader there in that community, to find out what he wanted to do. But anyway, what was interesting was the missionaries told us that prior to us coming there, they had gone to meet with him, and while they were sitting in his hut, he made these stones levitate. He just brought them up off the ground. And he looked at the missionary and said, "Now, can your God do that?" And the missionary, with a lot of wisdom, said, "I'm not going to ask my God to do that, but here's what I'll tell you. My God has done something that yours can't do." And he said, "What do you mean?" He said, "My God actually created those stones. And he's done something even more miraculous than making stones levitate. He's actually given us an opportunity to know him personally and live with him forever, even after we die. That's better than stones levitating." So unbeknownst to us, prior to this guy coming to see us, he went and threw those stones into the river because he was done. And he came, and we treated him. If y'all remember Dr. Richardson, y'all remember Jim Richardson? He was the doctor that treated him, and eventually that shaman came to faith in Christ and got baptized and became a part of the church. But that kind of stuff freaks some people out, but aren't you proud of those missionaries who had a sense enough to say, "Okay, that's fine, but I'm not impressed by that just because your God is making stones levitate. My God creates stones." You know, I thought that was a pretty good word. Have no idea how the Urim and Thummim worked. At the heart of it, though, is I just know it was one other way that God led his people. Okay? Then, a couple other things real quick. The consecration of the priest. That's chapter 29. That whole chapter is given to that, where God basically said, if you look at verse 1, this is what you're going to do to consecrate them so that they can actually do their job. So they're going to have to be ordained. They're going to have to be set aside. And there's just this detailed regimen of sacrifice. All these sacrifices have got to be made. These animals have got to be slain. Atonement's got to be made for their sin. But then what's fascinating, y'all, you get to verse 21 of Exodus 29, and God tells Moses this. He says, now, I want you to take some of the blood from the altar, because they've made all these sacrifices, you know. And I'm sorry, go back to verse 19, sorry. Verse 19, take this ram, take Aaron and his sons, and lay their hands on its head, slaughter it, take some of the blood and put it on the lobes of the right ears of Aaron and his sons, on the thumbs of their right hands, on the big toes of their right feet, and then splash blood against the side of the altar. Take some blood from the altar and some of the anointing oil and sprinkle it on Aaron and his garments and on his sons and their garments. Then he and his sons and their garments will be consecrated. So the Lord told Moses, once you've made all these sacrifices, you've atoned for their sin, take some of the blood, put it on their right earlobe, on their right thumb, their right toe, and then sprinkle their garments with it. And there's imagery there. The priest is supposed to hear from God. The priest is supposed to engage in the activities of God, and the priest is supposed to walk with God. So the entire body, if you will, is consecrated by God by this blood being placed on them. Does that make sense? And then just sprinkle it over their garments. So the priest is set aside for work. The point is, God's people are supposed to be led by godly people. That's just how, that goes all the way back to the very beginning. So the role of the priest, serve the Lord first. God said, minister to me. So you start with serving the Lord, then you serve the people. And notice when they're carrying the names of Israel, they're carrying all this stuff, the weight of Israel, if you will, on their shoulders. They carry the weight of the people. And the priests also every day worked in the daily sacrificial regimen in the tabernacle. So the priests were there to serve God and to serve the people. Now there's the principle that's woven in throughout the history of the people of God. God calls people to serve Him and to serve His people. And so when I think about in my own life, just the consecration, if you will, to lead God's people, you know, I don't believe y'all expect to be led by perfect people, right? But you do expect to be led by godly people. And so when I was teaching at Truett Seminary, I used to tell the students that I worked with all the time, you're going to have a couple of things that will give you an opportunity to serve God's people. One of those is going to be just your competency. If you're going to do this for a living, you need to be good at it. So you need to learn. You need to, in other words, you need to go ahead and study. Figure out how to, depending on the level that you want to go, learn how to read these biblical languages, learn to reflect theologically, learn how to study the Scripture, learn how to interpret the Scripture, learn how to pastor people. I mean, all those things are skills of competency. But then you also have your character, and that's just who you are as a person. And whether you're godly or not. And so every class I taught, I would always end it by saying, now, if you're ever going to disappoint the people of God, disappoint them with your competency and not your character. Does that make sense? The church can put up with incompetent leaders sometimes. It's really hard for the church to put up with ungodly leaders. And so to be consecrated is one thing. To be competent is another thing, and hopefully they go hand in hand, but I would just say the consecration part is the one to me that is incredibly important, and that's the message I believe you find in Exodus 28 and 29. Consecrate these people, even the garments they wear are holy, because the role that they play is going to be special in the life of the people, and it's a privilege to do it, y'all. I get it. You know, I've been pastoring for a long time. Trust me, I know what it's like, but I know the weight that you carry. You know, when Paul says, he talks about all the things that he went through, how he was beaten, he was tortured, he was put in jail, et cetera, et cetera. He said, plus I have to carry the concern of the churches. Well, that's the weight of people who serve in pastoral ministry. You carry the weight of the people. Aaron and them carried it on their bodies. You know, we don't necessarily do that anymore, but we still carry the weight of the people because we love you and we want to serve you. And so it's a unique relationship, I believe, that the clergy has with its people. And it's of God, and it's ancient, and we need to honor it. And it's a two-way street. You know, y'all have a role to play, and we have a role to play. And when it works together, it's a beautiful thing, isn't it? And we're all honored to participate in that relationship. So, all right, I'm going to stop right there. So those of you that are online, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time. Amen.